I had the privilege of being asked to speak with the Congressional Progressive Caucus today. I briefed them on the situation in Sudan and provided some key recommendations. It was a closed-door briefing, but I thought it'd be worthwhile to share the remarks that I had planned because I think we need to be talking more about Sudan. The situation in Sudan is one of the worst humanitarian situations in the world, and where, frankly, we're just not doing enough about it. And our government is in a unique place to actually do something to end this war, to end the mass atrocities. So, here are my remarks. I hope you will listen to them. 20 years ago, I was advocating on the Hill, meeting with members of Congress about the genocide in Darfur. It breaks my heart to be here in this capacity today, as we're watching the continuation of that genocide unfold, as well as the other mass atrocities that were perpetrated across Sudan over the last 2.5 years of this brutal war. The lack of accountability for crimes perpetrated across Sudan, from the North-South War to Darfur to the Nuba Mountains, several decades of impunity for mass atrocities have paved the way for the violence that we're seeing today. Yesterday, my colleagues and friends provided testimony at a briefing co-hosted by the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and Representative Omar's Africa Policy Working Group. My good friend Nadia told the room about her personal loss that she has suffered from the latest violence in Fasher. Her brother was killed. Her pregnant aunt was killed. Several friends killed. Many friends and family, including young children, remain missing. No one knows if they're alive or dead. Her elder cousin was killed when he was trying to protect his daughter from being raped by the RSF. Her niece, who was fortunate enough to leave El Fasher, couldn't make the journey to Tawila as she ran out of her diabetes medicine along the way and died. These are just a few stories about Nadia's family. There are tens of thousands more like it. We had been warning about El Fasher for 18 months. We saw the warning signs, and still, nothing was done to avert this tragedy. Sometimes it's hard to document mass atrocities, but in the most recent massacres in El Fasher, we didn't need Human Rights Watch, or IAN, or others. The RSF proudly posted their massacres for all to see on social media. We worked so hard to pass the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act into law, that President Trump signed into law. Many of you in this room supported that legislation. It stated that preventing mass atrocities was in our national interest, and our foreign policy should prioritize prevention. We failed. And we failed not only in El Fasher, but across Sudan, as SAF and RSF have committed mass atrocities and gross violations of human rights across the country. To watch President Biden barely lift a finger to help the Sudanese people, a man who during his time in the Senate advocated for sending in U.S. troops and initiating a no-fly zone to stop the genocide in Darfur, was deeply frustrating. This war is often painted as a war between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces. But really, this is a war against the Sudanese people. These armed actors are denying the people the dream of a civilian-led democracy, a dream that they put their lives on the line to achieve during the nationwide protests. And in some ways, this is a proxy war between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, more specifically between MBS and MBZ. In 2018 and 2019, we saw Sudanese across the country rise up and demand a change from the 30-year dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir. As someone who has worked on Sudan and worked closely with Sudanese for many years, it was incredible to see. Because for the first time in a long time, Sudanese civilians were united. In the past, the center-periphery mass atrocities in Darfur and the Nuba Mountains, far away from the capital of Khartoum, Sudanese in the capital often didn't stand up for their fellow Sudanese. But at this moment, in 2019, the people were united. I remember in 2019 when a senior State Department diplomat said that the protests sweeping across the country were just strikes protesting the price of fuel and bread, and that they'd be over soon. What a miscalculation. That miscalculation wouldn't be the last our government would make. There's a lot I can talk about, and I'm sure we'll get into other topics, but I want to focus on the failed approach to prevent and end this war and the mass atrocities. While civilians helped to topple the 30-year dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir, the SAF and the RSF were the ones that actually removed him from power. And while there were initially promises to install a civilian government, it was clear from the outset that neither Burhan nor Hemeti had any real interest in surrendering power. We saw this with the way that the Transitional Military Council was structured, with the coup against the civilian authority in 2021, and ultimately with the outbreak of the war. Sudanese civil society were screaming from the rooftops that these men could not be trusted. There were opportunities for more targeted diplomatic engagement, carrots and sticks, but little proactive engagement was done during this time. Once the war broke out, the U.S. seemed to be solely focused on a ceasefire. Myopically focusing only on negotiating a ceasefire separate and apart from political negotiations was doomed from the start. The reason for the war was political. Neither side had any interest in a ceasefire because they thought they could win the war. The only way out of the war was to figure out what each side wanted, find a compromise, and put enough pressure on both sides and their external backers to stop fighting. There was no incentive to stop fighting just for the sake of a ceasefire. What was the political solution? What gets the RSF to stop? What gets SAF to transition control to civilians? What do the main external actors, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, want? Where do civilians factor into the equation? Answering these questions was not the priority of the Biden administration. Little effort was put into trying to answer these questions, and frankly, we still don't have good answers today. When I would talk to folks at the State Department pushing for an answer, urging wider process, begging for involvement of Sudanese civilians in negotiations, the answer I repeatedly got was, we're focusing on the technical aspects of the ceasefire. Civilians don't have a role to play in these discussions. Once we get to a ceasefire, we'll shift into a political conversation and slowly bring civilians in. That was fundamentally the wrong approach, and yet it seemed to remain the strategy for the entirety of the war, and seems to be the strategy today. To get to a real political solution, we need skilled, high-level diplomatic engagement with all parties. Not more meaningless statements from the Quad, with actors who are speaking out of both sides of their mouths, urging peace while they're arming the perpetrators of the mass atrocities. The SAF and the RSF need to be pushed to the negotiating table. Cutting off the flow of arms and money is a start, but really, their backers need to tell them enough is enough, and they won't support them any longer, even if they win the war. That will only happen with pressure. There's a lot of attention on the UAE's complicity in arming the RSF, as there should be. But other key allies continue to pour arms into Sudan, including Egypt and Turkey. The growing use of drones in this war can largely be attributed to Turkey's arms. It was obvious and stated outright that the Biden administration made the decision to go easy on Sudan's external actors because Biden wanted their continued support for Israel as Israel continued the genocidal campaign in Gaza and the expansion in the West Bank. We need more pressure on all parties to bring this war to an end. And once negotiations start, civilians must absolutely play a role. They should be involved at every single stage of the process. Much of the work to get us there should start now, supporting civilian actors to come together and build a plan for the future of Sudan. We don't need to wait until the guns stop to start that work. But a lot of the funding and support for those kinds of programs have been cut off, along with documentation effort, training, and of course, humanitarian assistance. It wasn't just the shutdown of U.S. aid that impacted Sudan's programming. It was the support from PRM for refugee assistance, training and emergency support from DRL, documentation efforts from GCJ, atrocity prevention efforts from CSO, and other departments that have either been eliminated or hollowed out by the Trump administration. I could go on, but let me stop here with some key recommendations. Pressure the external actors, all of them. Sanctions are a tool, not a policy. Too often, our government throws sanctions at the wall as the only measure of action. We need to be methodical with these sanctions, see if they are working, and make adjustments. Sanctions also won't have their intended effect if the external actors don't feel the pressure. There's only so much putting sanctions on a single actor in Sudan will actually do. But secondary and tertiary sanctions, they can make an impact. Utilize tools like the Global Magnitsky Act and others. Follow the money and sanction downstream so that we are actually impacting those that are funneling funds to the armed actors. Push the administration to either appoint a special envoy and staff that office or delegate another high-level leadership role to lead on Sudan and actually do it. I don't think a special envoy in and of itself is the solution, but we need some high-level sustained diplomatic leadership that's actually going to lead on the Sudan issue. Right now, we don't have that. Expand support for civilian protection and humanitarian access. We need to demand answers from this administration on funding streams, where the money's going, and at what levels. Last year, global humanitarian funding needs were funded at 70% by the end of the year. In 2025, as the situation got significantly worse in many parts of Sudan, humanitarian assistance is less than 30% funded. That's a huge shortfall. Include Sudanese civilians at every part of the process. We need civilian engagement in every part of the process: ceasefire negotiations, humanitarian negotiations, and peace negotiations. They should be included every step of the way. We know that civilian engagement leads to a more durable peace process. It needs to happen. I know that there hasn't been a peacekeeping force in many years that has been deployed at the level that we need, but we need a protection of civilian force in Sudan. It has to be done We need to figure out the willpower and make it happen. We should be preparing and supporting accountability measures now, supporting documenters, supporting them in the ways that we were doing before, helping them with documentation efforts, helping them with secure communication channels, and helping them with secure storage so that one day accountability may come. We need to lift the ridiculous sanctions on the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court, while by no means perfect, is the only court that has actually brought any semblance of justice for the Sudanese people. There are open cases still today. They are trying to do more investigations on the current crisis. Those efforts are hampered by the sanctions on the court. There's new reporting that the Trump administration is fearful of ICC prosecution and is expecting to sanction the court further. This will do irrevocable harm to the court and harm any future accountability measures. The ICC needs to be able to do its job. We need to fight back about revoking temporary protective status and humanitarian parole for Sudanese. After meeting with MBS, Trump said that Sudan is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. We can't justify sending people back there. It doesn't make sense. Sudan's in a unique situation because, honestly, for whatever reason you may want to be involved in the crisis, there's a menu of options that you can choose from. So for Republicans and conservatives that may not be sold on getting involved in Sudan just purely on humanitarian reasons, concerned about the rise of radical Islamists, civilian rule is the way to counter that. Civilians want a secular Sudan. Concerns with attacks on Christian minorities, civilian rule. Concerned with the spread of violent extremism across the Sahel, civilian rule. Concerned by Iran, Russia, and China's interest in building naval bases in Port Sudan, granting key access to the Red Sea corridor, civilian rule. The rush to democratization isn't easy. Transitions are messy. But we can do better. We must do better.